This series of videos is going to be talking about how to handle your own car accident case, your injury claim, and the property damage without going to a lawyer, without going to court. And the reason is because sometimes you don't need a lawyer, and sometimes people call me up and they could probably just handle it themselves. So I'm going to be talking about that in this series of videos. In this first video, I'm going to be talking about when you probably need a lawyer versus when you don't need a lawyer. I'm going to be talking about the big picture, some pitfalls, things to avoid that you don't want to make these mistakes when you're handling the case on your own. A couple things you should know. Number one, this is not meant to be legal advice. It's more like a general guide for how to handle your own car accident case without a lawyer. You should really, you just by watching these videos, you don't become a client of mine. It's just like I said, a general guide. And I practice in California. It's 2020 right now. The laws are different in different states. So you should do the research if you're in a different state, or even if you're in California, do the research because it also changes over time. It's 2020 right now. And a year from now, the laws could change as to how these things are done. So you should double check that. Who am I? Well, my name is Jonathan Howell. I've been practicing law for well over 10 years in California, and I've handled all sorts of injury claims, not just car accidents, but all sorts of anytime someone's been hurt or lost a loved one, I help them kind of get back on their feet medically and financially. But I've done a ton of car accident cases, and I'm very familiar with the process, so I'm happy to make these videos to help people out there. When you're deciding whether you really need a lawyer or not, I made a list of some things you should consider. This is not the exhaustive list of the only things you should consider, but the main things. And probably the most important thing are your injuries. If you have complicated injuries or injuries that are unusual or different, it's going to be a lot harder to handle the case on your own. The insurance company is going to give you a lot more pushback, and you may want to consult with a lawyer at that point. Injuries that are more straightforward are like whiplash injuries where you get a little bit of treatment, maybe a little bit of chiropractic treatment goes away, or you had some bruising or cuts or something like that, and it kind of goes away and that's the end of it. Those are a little bit more simple. They can get complicated like everything else, but that's what I mean by the injuries. Pre-existing conditions. Pre-existing conditions are, everybody through life, they end up with different medical issues that can affect either get exacerbated in a car crash or get like flared up, things like that, or compound the injuries that you currently have. That can make it complicated when you're dealing with an insurance company. And again, that might tip the scales into whether you should get a lawyer or not. When you're dealing with the government, so if you get into a car crash with a city official or a federal agent or a federal employee, that makes things very complicated. There's special deadlines. You don't want to blow any deadlines when you're dealing with them. There's different rules that apply to the government sometimes. So you got to be very careful. And at that point, you probably may want to speak to a lawyer. One of the things you really want to be careful about if you're going about it alone without a lawyer is what's called the statute of limitations, which is the deadline to file a lawsuit. You don't need to file a lawsuit right away. You can negotiate in front, and that's generally what I'm going to be talking about in these videos. But you do not want to blow the statute of limitations. You do not want to blow a deadline. And that's probably the single most important thing. In California right now, for a general average injury case, it's about 2 years to file a lawsuit. You don't even want to wait 2 years. You don't want to get close to that deadline. You want to do things. If it's not going to settle, you should know like within a year and deal with it. But if you're suing the government or there's other exceptions, if it's a medical malpractice case, there are different deadlines. So you should definitely always research the statute of limitations and double check that. Liability. Liability is who's at fault for the crash. And sometimes that's not always clear. And if there's some evidence or argument that maybe you're at fault and you know that you're not at fault, and that work in order to prove that you're not at fault could be complicated or tricky. And at that point, it may make sense to have a lawyer. If it's a clear liability case, meaning no issue about it, who's at fault, like a rear end, sometimes there can be a dispute, but most rear ends are pretty straightforward. Then maybe you don't need a lawyer for that. Also, with a simple injury like I talked about, like a simple whiplash, or you had some muscle sprain that just kind of went away with a little bit of treatment, maybe you don't need a lawyer. Maybe you can just even go through small claims. When there's multiple defendants, that can make things very complicated, and multiple people who contributed to the crash, that can make things complicated. And that also means there's going to be multiple insurance. And at that point, maybe you want to get a lawyer. Also, if someone was employed during the crash, like one of the person that hit you, if they were employed, that can make things complicated. And at that point, you want to maybe hire a lawyer because the employer could be on the hook. The insurance limits are important to know, and that can make things complicated. So, for example, if there's multiple parties and there's a huge amount of insurance and maybe even an umbrella policy and that stuff, it can get very complicated very quickly. On the other hand, if there's maybe one insurance policy and it's $15,000, it's a very low limit, that makes it a lot more simple for you to handle, and your injuries are simple. Maybe that's a situation where you could probably get by without a lawyer, maybe. Small claims court, that's something that you can, in California, a lawyer is not even allowed to represent you, I believe, at the small claims court proceeding. I think there's some exceptions to that, but for the most part, a lawyer is not allowed to be there. And it's actually I've helped clients with small claims, prepping the notebooks and evidence. And that's something you could totally do. And there's a lot of websites with further details on that. And I'll talk a little bit about that in these videos. Other times where you may want to consider having a lawyer, unusual situations like a hit and run. That's when someone hits your car and then takes off. That can get complicated dealing with your own insurance company and the steps needed for that. If there's some related to some criminal activity, I had a case where the person had stolen a car and then caused a crash, and the police were chasing him. And that sort of situation may make sense to hire a lawyer because there's some criminal overlay, and did the police do something wrong? I don't know, but that's another kind of tricky situation. Another thing that you should be aware of, and I wrote MedPay there, is that sometimes your insurance, you have coverages that could come into play, and it gets a little tricky on how to access those. And if you're not sure and you don't want to leave anything on the table, because that's really the main reason why you hire a lawyer. A lawyer knows how to get everything that you are entitled to. MedPay is one of those. It's like some money that you can use to get money to pay for medical bills. Let's see the big picture. So in California where I practice, basically there's the car crash, and then there's the different players involved. There's the insurance companies. There's multiple insurance companies. Usually you have one, and the other person has an insurance company. And those are people that's who's going to be paying and doing investigation on the case. The setting, what I mean by that is where you are, because it makes a difference, like where the defendant lives, where the car crash lives, or where the car crash happened. And it can make a difference where what laws get applied, what courthouses you should be involved in. I had somebody call me up that they lived in California, but they were visiting in Florida, had a car crash there, and it seemed likely that they needed a Florida attorney. So that's how it can get kind of tricky. Adjusters are people who work for the insurance company that investigate the claim and negotiate with you. Courts, there's different types of courts. So there's small claims court. That's for cases under, it's either 10,000 or 7,500. I think 10,000 generally, 7,500 in car accident cases in California and now in Los Angeles right now. There's state court. That's when you're dealing, most cases are in state court, cases that are car crashes. Federal court is a separate kind of parallel court that exists, in California. There's multiple federal courts. Those are for specific types of cases, but you could end up in federal court, for example, if your car crash was involving a federal employee, that could pull you out into federal court. Or if you were suing it could be another situation if you were suing like a business that had no relationship to California, and sometimes they try to remove the case to federal court. Arbitration. An arbitration is like a private trial, usually done by a former judge or an attorney, and it kind of operates the same way as if you had filed a lawsuit, but it's done privately, like in a business, in an office building, in a conference room. And then sometimes you deal with administrative courts or administrative hearings, like the DMV is kind of an example of an administrative hearing if you ever have to go down there and argue about something. Those are the different types of courts involved. These videos I'm going to be talking about are without going to court. That's the whole idea. But you should be aware of what's out there. Defendants, that's the person that caused the crash, the person you're up against. Then there's medical providers, and they play an important role in these cases because they provide treatment to you, and they sometimes want to get paid or reimbursed, and that you got to negotiate with them, or their report, you need them to write a report that explains something, so you got to deal with them. And then of course there's the lawyers, and their role in this whole thing, primarily representing people and negotiating, acting on your behalf. The typical case has multiple phases. There's the first phase, which is the crash itself, the injury producing event. Then, the person starts getting medical treatment. And I call that phase, this first part, the investigation phase, because a lot of what we're doing is gathering evidence, figuring out witnesses, collecting photos, looking into the property damage, also collecting evidence of medical treatment and what's involved there. After the investigation phase and collecting evidence phase, we go into the negotiation phase. After that, we go into the negotiation phase. That's where we collect all the evidence and we submit it to the insurance company, and we start negotiating with them and asking for money. Sometimes you can resolve the case at that point, sometimes you can't. If it doesn't resolve at that point, then we file a lawsuit and we go to court. And if we go to court, then that's when you start litigating, and you most likely want a lawyer. I would highly recommend you get a lawyer if you're going to court. If you're going to small claims court, you probably don't need a lawyer. After even going to litigation, there's multiple phases. Like there's phases for going to trial, there's phases for discovery, there's phases for appeal, and all of that, which I'm not going to get into right now. And then even when you settle the case, also, even now, there's what I call the post-settlement phase, where you have to do things related to the settlement. Like sometimes you have to deal with Medicare if you use Medicare and negotiate with them, and that's what I call the post-settlement phase. And I listed out all the different sections here. Okay, so that's kind of it for this first video, kind of giving you a general overview. The next videos will go into more detail with the different ways that you can handle the case on your own, and how to do that without a lawyer and without going to court. And of course, if you have any questions, you can visit my website, howljustice.com, give us a call, send us a note or a message. And there's also a blog there with more free resources that you can use if you have any questions.